Welcome back, everybody. I'm John Mello. I run the software development company called PayHouse, and we build web and mobile applications focusing primarily on Bubble.io. What we're going to take a look at today is what I think is probably the highest level of core Bubble. And what I mean by that is that it's the most advanced features that Bubble offers without extending it through some plugin or custom CSS, JavaScript, HTML. It's within Bubble's core code base and really highlights how robust the platform is as compared to other no-code tools. And the functionality that I'm referring to are backend workflows and recursive workflows, otherwise known in development as loops. Right, so these are very handy. You can get very creative with these. I'm going to use an example today, and you should be following along as you're watching this tutorial. You should be following along in your own editors and recreating exactly what I'm doing, so that when you and I speak, you already have a concept of what these are, and you've implemented one or two of these. Right, so the example that I'm going to use today is the perspective of somebody who's like a meetup administrator, right? So hopefully you're familiar with the platform meetup.com or Eventbrite. Would be like an administrator of a meetup group who is creating events and trying to communicate with the members of that group when these events will take place. Some very basic elements on the screen here. We have a form here. This is an input. This is a date time picker. This is an image uploader, checkbox, and a button. And on this side, we have a repeating group with some icons in it. This is set up to display information about the meetups, right? You can see that if I click into the repeating group, we're searching up to a data type that I've named meetups. All right, so we've only got two data types that we're working with in my user table here. I've got two users, and that's going to be important later. And I've got the meetup table. There isn't anything in here now. So pretty blank, right? Not a lot going on here, but I will put a link to this editor in the description of this video so that you can see, so that you can recreate this and see exactly how I have it set up. You don't have to do it exactly how I do it, like be creative here, but you do want to implement what I'm going to show you with the workflow, the backend workflow, and the recurring event. As you're going through this, try to broaden the examples that I'm using and think about how would you use this in your own use cases, right? Just because I'm doing this one way, this doesn't mean that it's the only application for back-end workflows. There's infinite possibilities for what you can do here. I'm just using this one example, okay? So try to broaden the example that I'm using to different use cases and situations that make sense for you, okay? So the first thing, we're going to start simple, all right? The first thing that we're going to do is just create an event out of this form using these inputs here, right? So I'm going to double click on create event, start edit workflow, and we're going to go to data, create a new thing, and the type of thing that we're going to create is a meetup, right? We've already said that we've had that data type in our database, and we're going to set the 4 fields that make up this meetup group, right? So the name of the event, that's just going to be very simple. Input events names value. Again, we're just referring to the elements that are on the front end here, right? These are the input event names. It's important that you name your elements properly always. All right, date is going to be date time pickers, event, value. The image is going to be picture uploaders events value. And then finally the checkbox, or the weekly, whether or not this is a weekly event, it's just a Boolean value, or yes, no, is going to refer to the checkbox. So checkbox, this event recurs weekly, is checked. This will produce a yes in the database if this expression is true. All right, so let's just start there. Let's just add another thing to clear the inputs. So we can say reset inputs, so the inputs don't hold that data once we've created a new event. All right, so let's just start off and see if that works, right? Again, we're starting small here. We start small and build big. So I'm going to call this Twitch event. We're going to set that to be today at 1:20 p.m. I've got the daytime picker set up in 5-hour increments. We'll select this image here. And I'm not going to check this off yet. So we hit create event, and we go. We've got our event created. Okay, so the use case here is going to be that when the user clicks on this calendar icon in the repeating group, that sends out an email reminder that's scheduled to go out 2 minutes before the event is scheduled to start. The reason it has to be a back-end workflow is because this is something that is scheduled to happen in the future. Pause this video. What you should do here is pause this video and just read up a little bit about a client-server relationship. Some concept, just so you have some concept of what the client-server relationship is. Client-side versus server-side actions. In this case, what you're doing with a back-end workflow, also known as an API workflow, which people often find confusing, those are used interchangeably by Bubble. What you're doing is you're scheduling something to happen on your own server. Right? So anytime you need something to happen in the future, not immediately when somebody clicks on a button, you need to use a backend workflow. All right, so let's go back to our repeating group here. Let's double click on this. Let's double click on the icon. We're going to hit Start Edit Workflow. And we're going to go down to Custom Events. And we're going to go to Schedule API Workflow. What you're going to see on the top is that the Workflow API is not activated for your app. Please do this in Settings API. So we click on this, and it takes us to our Settings tab, and specifically the API sub-tab of the Settings tab. All right, so let's just look at what we have going on here in this Public API Endpoints section. All right, so we have Enable Workflow API and Backend Workflows. Once we do that, check this out. Look here, there's nothing below add a new reusable element. When I click this, enable API workflow, and I do believe you need to be on at least a personal plan for this to work correctly, you'll see that we have access to this new page here called backend workflows. All right, we're going to come back to that in a second, but this checkbox is what does that. Now, you'll also notice that it gives you this root URL. This is the root URL to your app so that a third party can run workflows on your application. If I say here, check off Enable Data API, I click this, it's going to give you a privacy warning because obviously you're exposing the data that's inside of your application. You want to be careful about what you're exposing. You probably wouldn't want to expose people's personal information. And now you have this other endpoint. Now you have this other endpoint here that people can use to get data base. So now I've got the meetup data type checked off here. If I just copy this into my browser and then put /meetup, you can see that this information is readily available to anybody on the internet who's looking for it, right? This is the event that we just created in our workflow, in our previous action, right? The Twitch event that we just created. It's all here in JSON format for other people to consume. And this is what JSON looks like. We talked pretty extensively about the JSON data format in my Demystifying API documentation video. And this is that format for the data in your application. Right, so it's cool. It's all related. It all comes kind of full circle here. So let's close this out and get back on track. It's important that you understand what it is that these things enable you to do. All right, so let's go back to our workflow. Now you see that error is gone. Now we're gonna go to API. We're gonna hit this drop down and hit Edit Backend Workflows, and that's gonna take us to a special place in Bubble where there is no front end. This is only backend stuff, right? So you'll notice up here that I'm on the backend workflow tab. It's kind of its own special page like I showed you before. And here we can only run actions. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to General and then go to New API Workflow. Again, just think of API workflow and backend workflow being used interchangeably here. Bubble kind of says it different ways in different places. All right, we're going to call this email reminders. Now, it's important to know that when you are, all API workflows need to have a unique name, and they need to be lowercase with no spaces. Treat it like a URL, all right? But this does have to be unique. We're going to set up a couple of parameters here. And what a parameter is just a piece of information that you're passing through this workflow for further processing, right? So we're getting this information from somewhere. In this case, it's coming from our front end. All right, and we're going to pass the information of a meetup. And that will be a data type meetup. You can see that you have to set the type of data that it is, same way that you would set it up in the database, right? You have to set the type of information that you're passing so Bubble knows how to handle it. That's one parameter that we're going to pass, and we're also going to pass some user information, right? So we want the users that are going to be part of this email list here, right? So it's going to be user and just the type user. Okay, now I'm going to click here to add an action, go down to email, send email, and the email we're going to send to is user, right? So these are just referring to the parameters that we have just set up. Okay, so these are arbitrary. We can name them whatever we want. I'm actually going to lowercase this just to illustrate. Right? If I change that to lowercase m, we now have it's a lowercase m. So whatever you call it, and when you set the parameters here, is how you're going to refer to it throughout the workflow. All right, so we're going to say users email, right? We have the access to all of the different fields in our user table. Sender's name, I'll just make this a standard, jmello@payhouse.co. Subject, we'll just make this, don't forget, get to attend meetups, event name, exclamation. And same thing in the body, we could just say something like, this is a reminder to join meetup, put dynamic data, meetup, event's name, happening at meetup date, period. Okay, so that's going to be the reminder. This is all we need to do from the backend perspective, but we still haven't set where this information is going to be coming from, right? So let's go back to the front end. You'll also notice that we have two issues up on top. If we click on this, schedule API workflow, it'll take us back to the front end, back when the user clicks on the calendar icon, and we have to set this information up now. Actually, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to change this to a list. I'm going to, instead of just doing schedule an API workflow, I'm going to do schedule custom events, schedule an API workflow on a list, because we are working with a list of users. I think it makes more sense in this situation. All right, so type of things is going to be a user. This is the list that we're running on. It's not a list of meetups because we're only working with one meetup, the cell that the user clicks into. The list to run on, however, is going to be do a search for users. Okay, and you can obviously put constraints on this if you have more than one group more than one group here, more than one group, then you would constrict it based on who is a part of that group. We're just going to search for all of them because we only have 2 users in the database. Now the API workflow that we're going to choose, you can see that we have email reminders, the one that we just created in our backend workflow tab, and the scheduled date. This is the important part. So we're going to say current cells meetup, again, just to refer back, referring to whatever cell that the user here is clicking into, the administrator is clicking into, current cells meetups date plus minutes minus 2. Right, so whatever the meetup state is, and date in Bubble is really a date time, right? It's a combination of the day and the time, minus 2 minutes. So just go back 2 minutes, and that's when this thing is going to be scheduled. If you are working with the list, Bubble is going to ask you to set the interval in which you want these things to be scheduled. It's not. If you're working on very big lists, you want to put at least 5 seconds between each scheduled thing. This doesn't affect the time that the actual email will be sent out. They should all go out at the same time, but it does affect when these things will be scheduled on your server. And if you put the interval too low, it may overwhelm the server. It may overwhelm your server, and the workflow could just time out. So these should look familiar. These are the parameters that we set up in our back end. All right, so we have meetup. We're going to say the meetup that we're passing through the back end, we're passing to the back end for the meetup that we're passing to the back end for further processing is going to be the current sales meetup. And the user is just going to be this user, right? Which is kind of just like, it's a weird expression unique to like scheduling API workflows, but it just means like the user that this list is currently on. I don't know a good way to say it, but it'll make sense once you see how it works. Okay, so this is all we really should need to do in order to get these emails, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create another event. Let's call this bubble event. We're going to schedule this for today, April 14th at 1:10 p.m. All right, we'll put a logo in here. And we're going to leave this unchecked, and we're going to hit create event. Okay, so now we've got our bubble event, and I'm going to click the calendar icon. All right, now, how do we know what happened? We really don't just by looking at this. But what I'm going to point you to is a very important tab when it comes to working with backend workflows, the logs. Right? This often gets ignored, I think, by people who just start using Bubble, but there's some very useful information in here, so you should see what's happening. So you should see what's going on. Think of so if I tab over to the scheduler and I hit show, these are my email reminders. Why is there two? Because we have two users. Very simple. Right? There's two users in the database. Each one of these is going to send an email reminder out to each one. Right? So think of your scheduler. And you'll notice the scheduled time. The meetup is scheduled to start at 1:10. We set it to go out 2 minutes before, so it's scheduled on our server at 1:08. So in 1 more minute, I should be able to go to my email and see this reminder. Now, if I hit show, check it out. If I hit show now because it's 1:08, these should disappear because they went out. And if I go to my server logs, search, we'll see that this thing happened. We'll see all the events that took place here, right? And this is particularly useful for debugging problematic bugs that are happening in your workflow. If you're getting an unexpected behavior of a workflow action, you should be looking here to see why is this happening. As you can see, it gives you a lot of useful information on what's happening in the workflow. It's an email to jmello1285@gmail, right, at 1:08 p.m. on the dot. Okay, so server logs is everything that's happened in the past. Scheduler is everything that's scheduled to happen in the future. So you can see in both of my emails here that this went out. This is a reminder to join. Event happening at 1:14. Same thing here on my jmello1285 email account. This is an event reminder. So this worked the way that we expected it to. The next thing we're going to do is work with a recursive workflow, something that is scheduled to happen in the future and then keeps setting itself up until some condition is met. In this case, we're going to go with the same type of scenario, but say we're setting up, as the administrator, we want to set up a recurring weekly event. And we want these reminders to now go out on a weekly basis. We can do the same thing 2 minutes before the event is scheduled to start, but we don't want to have to like click it every single time we want an event to go out. And this is also, we want it to happen on a regular schedule. Now, this is also useful. Some other situations that come to mind is if you're doing like a subscription payment model where you want to charge your clients at the first of every month or the middle of every month, whatever it is, you want that to happen automatically in the background. You don't want to have to think about that. We're going to go back to the button create event is. Now, notice that when I go to click here to add an action and I go to plugins, there's nothing here. I'm going to go ahead and install a plugin to send out a tweet. All right, and there's only one, or there's a few. You can work directly with Twitter's API, but there's one that I like here just for kind of demonstration purposes. And I'm going to use, is this one here, the Twitter tweet by No Code Lab. API keys, I'll do this off camera. I'll do this off camera because I don't want to expose my API keys. But if you I'll put this link in the description of this video as well. It's pretty easy to get Twitter API keys. So if you want to actually do this, and I do recommend that you do, go to this link, set up your API keys, and actually set this up to go out. You'll be glad that you did. To go back, so once you have your Twitter API keys in the plugin tab, go back to your backend workflow page. And then let's add a new API. We're going to go to new API workflow. And we're going to say tweet reminder. Tweet. So in this case, instead of sending out an email, we're going to be sending out a tweet to remind everybody that they are a part, that this event is happening. All right, so we don't need to pass any user information into this backend workflow. All we need is the meetup info. So we'll just type in meetup, the lowercase, meetup here. Now that we have our tweet plugin installed, you'll see an action here that's available that says tweet. And now we can do the same thing here. Instead of the email, we're just going to put in reminder to join. Oh, I'm going to lose that. Back out of that click. Reminder. We'll say, don't forget to join Meetup's event name. Exclamation. And you can also pass an image here, so we can actually use that image field that we have. So, right, so in kind of knowing a limitation of this plugin, you do have to type HTTP. I only know this because I've worked with it before. You really wouldn't. There isn't really anything in the documentation about that for this plugin, but you can do like Meetup's image, right? And this should produce the actual image. We'll see if that works. Now let's go back to the front end. We're kind of working back to front here, which I think is the better way to do it because you want to work backwards from your end goal. Our end goal is to get this tweet out 2 minutes before the event is ready to start. Now let's give the back end some information to work with. We have to send it the meetup information. So we're going to go back to our front end here, back to my index page, and we'll set this workflow on the create event button. So I'm going to go click here to add another action, custom event. Schedule an API workflow. We're not working with a list this time. And we're going to say tweet reminder, schedule date. Again, we're going to use a similar methodology as before. Step 1, where the meetup got created here. Result of step 1's date plus minutes minus 2. And then the meetup information is going to be very simple. It's just going to be result of step 1. Okay, we are referring back to the initial step where the meetup actually got created. We're passing that information to the backend workflow for further processing. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do that's new is add an only when condition. I only want this to schedule when the event is marked as weekly. If you recall, we have a checkbox here that says this event recurs weekly. I only want these weekly tweets to be set up if this is going to be a recurring event. So I'm going to say only when result of step 1's weekly is yes. All right? Otherwise, it'll ignore this step entirely. It'll just skip over this part of the workflow. Okay, now, the last thing that we're going to do before we test this out is we are going to set up the recursion part of this, right? So we have the tweet set out. We have the tweet to go out. Now we want to keep setting this up, right? We want to keep setting this up until some condition is met. So what we're going to say, custom event, schedule an API workflow. API workflow is going to be tweet reminder. So when do we want this to, so when do we want the next one to go out? Well, we want it to be the current date and time whenever this thing is triggered, current date and time, plus 7 days, because it's a weekly event. Current date and time plus 7 days. And the meetup, again, is going to be the same. This doesn't change. That just remains the meetup. Okay, so what's happening? Let's just go through this one more time, because if you're struggling to understand this, that's okay. That's normal if this is the first time that you're seeing this. Working with loops, I don't think is particularly intuitive, right? There's some learning here. I think it'll make sense once you actually recreate it, or even better, come up with your own scenario and try to work through this process. It is a process, right? I didn't know the conditions when I first set this up. When I set this up the first time, I didn't know the conditions that were going to make this work correctly. I had to kind of figure it out through trial and error. So don't stress out if this is the first time you're seeing it. Just try to recreate it in practice, and eventually it's going to start to make sense. Okay, now, tweet reminder, current days. Yeah, so what's happening? So just to kind of summarize what's happening, somebody is creating an event. They're marking it as weekly. We're taking that information, passing it through to the back end. We're passing the meetup information like this through this parameter, sending out a tweet, right? And then we're scheduling that same thing to happen in 7 days' time, right? And that's going to keep happening forever until we set some condition to make this stop, right? So if I just leave it like this will keep happening till the end of time, or whenever bubble stops being bubble. You can also set a condition for when this will stop. This is very common in loops too. You may be working through a very large list. You may be working through a very large list of like 1 million records. And when you get to the end of that list, you're going to want these actions to stop happening. Okay, so the condition is probably the hardest part of this. In this case, I think the use case would be like maybe schedule them through the end of the year. And an example of what this would look like is like current date and time is less than 12/31. 12/31/22 of the 12/31 of the current year, something like that. All right, so there always has to be some yes/no expression that will stop this from happening again. We're going to leave this blank for now, just to see how this. We're going to leave this blank though. So okay, so the moment of truth. All right, so you can see that this is the last tweet. You can see this is the last tweet that went out on April 10th, and this is one that I've pinned. We should get another one when we run this action. Okay, so let's do Android event. We're going to schedule that for, let's do 1:30. So today at 1:30 p.m. I have my Android Studio thing here, and I'm going to put this event recurs weekly, check that off, and then hit create event. Okay, so we've got that here. Let's first, again, let's check our scheduler. Nothing should have happened yet. Let's check our scheduler. What do we have going out? Good. We've got the tweet reminder scheduled to go out for this meetup, the meetup with this unique ID, and it's scheduled to go out 2 minutes before the event is going to start. So at 1:28, we should go to my Twitter account and see this tweet actually go out. And now the measure of success for the recursion is going to be whether or not this event gets set up again in 7 days' time. So April 21st in this case. Okay, so we're back on my Twitter account at 1:28. If I refresh the page, there we go. Don't forget to join Android event with a big ass Android icon. All right, so that worked. Now, if I go back to my scheduler, the moment of truth, there we go. April 21st, 1:28. So this is going to keep going out. It's going to keep scheduling. It's going to keep scheduling for 7 days. So this works correctly. That is good. If you get this, if you've gotten this far, you are awesome. You are working at the highest level of core bubble. So be proud of yourself. This is an accomplishment. It's going to take some time to understand. If you didn't make it here, that's okay. It's going to take some practice. All right, but keep going back, work through this tutorial, and then build your own recursive workflow for a situation that works for you, that makes sense to your application idea. All right, then when we meet, let's talk about where things went wrong, what you're struggling with. And this is my favorite stuff to work with because I think, like I said in the beginning, it demonstrates the real robustness of this platform and how much you can really do with it. All right. So that's it for today. Again, I'm John Mello, and we covered backend and recursive workflows today. I will talk to you soon.